All right, discovery calls that don't suck. You don't have much time on these discovery calls. We want to cover how to actually uncover real pain in these conversations in 15 minutes and get a solid next step solidified with a good persona that you're targeting. Brought on Eric again to help us with the conversation. He's someone who's probably more qualified than almost anyone to talk about this. He's sold at small, medium, large organizations. Now he's a founder running a lot of these calls himself, training other people how to run these calls. So we're going to go through how to actually break down a discovery call, his process. And Eric, thanks for being on here.
Yeah, of course, man. I appreciate it. And anyone listening, I think if you've seen Connor's content, my content as well, this is not some silver bullet, like golden script. It really is to help you better understand holistically how to approach this situation such that regardless of what happens, you're in a position to take the best next step, whatever that may be. So thanks for having me, man. Yeah.
So, to kick things off, I think a lot of SDRs and account executives feel like they dread discovery. I know I did when I was a new SDR and I had promoted to account executive and I didn't feel like I had a process or framework down yet. And I was using what was taught to me, but it just felt stiff to me or it felt scripted. Why at a high level do you think, but not to be harsh, but why do most discovery calls suck? And why do reps feel this way a lot of times before they have a process they're comfortable or have down for themselves?
Totally. No, and I'm fine to be direct here. I think, quite frankly, first and foremost, you need to ask yourself if you've done the work to understand your product, understand your persona, understand some of the most important challenges that they face, not just the solutions, but what are the types of problems that you're solving. So instead of coming to the table and saying, we help Samsung do XYZ 30% faster, like what was the actual problem Samsung was having, and what was that problem on 3 different levels? So to your initial question of why people feel nervous when they first get in these, it's really the fear of the unknown, because everything's going great so long as your prospect kind of asks or dances in the stuff that you already know, if you're like 3 months in as an AE and still learning. But beyond that, it's like if they hit you with some random super technical question, instead of learning how to understand that ideally, but if not, also dance around that with questions, uncover the real impact of where that's coming from. That's where I would say AEs, especially 3 to 6 months, either into being an account executive for the first time ever or at a new company, are the most nervous. And that's, you're playing scared, and this hurts you, last thing, in like multiple ways, where one, you're only asking the questions that you feel comfortable with and you feel comfortable responding to. And then also, obviously, the most glaring example, if you've been there, and I have too, we've all been there, by the way, but if you get told a response of like, oh, this like low level Kubernetes feature XYZ, like that's super important to us. And you're like, and then you just freeze and lose all momentum versus planning ahead, accepting the fact that there are going to be times you don't know the answer and how to handle that. But it's also on you as a rep to really understand your product, your problems that you solve for, your personas, et cetera, et cetera. But that's a high level.
I think that's spot on. That's exactly how I felt when I was a new SDR. Starting to first move into the AE role and run these discovery calls myself, it was the fear of the unknown and fear that I would get caught flat-footed. I would come in with some general questions prepared, an idea of how I thought the conversation felt, but I didn't have a consistent framework or process for myself. And in the back of my head, it was almost like when I was learning cold calling for the first time, and you would get this fear in your head, like, uh-oh, what are they going to say next? And how am I going to respond to it? It was almost the same way on these discovery calls, where it's like, if I ran out of my prepared list of questions or the conversation went in a different direction completely than I was expecting, that I would just freeze up and look like an idiot, frankly. That was my biggest fear going into all of these calls. And it wasn't until I implemented a consistent framework for myself. And that's what I think reps need to do, is they take a step back. Again, with the cold call analogy, it wasn't until I realized that the purpose, and at least in my opinion, the purpose of making a cold call is to set a meeting. And then I created a framework around doing that and making the structure of the cold call to set a meeting. It became important to realize, take a step back and be like, what is the purpose of a discovery call? Why are we here? So from your perspective, what is the purpose of a discovery call when you're getting on with one of these prospects that you booked a meeting with, either over the phone or email?
Yeah, and I think there's nuances to this at every level. But obviously, I would say the first and like universal thing is ideally to uncover significant pain that is worth solving within ideally a fiscal year or calendar year. Again, the timelines and all of that is going to change. But first and foremost, if you don't have real pain, especially right now in 2025, it's not going to move the needle. I can't tell you how many people I've talked to, both for this platform and in my job, that have something they could solve in theory. They could get better at sales. They could get better at automation. They could get better at all of these different things. But unless they truly understand and feel that they are leaving tons of money on the table or are actively missing things because of that, it's really difficult to progress it forward. So that's like the universal. And then I would say the biggest difference I see from like SMB selling to companies with maybe 100 employees or less up to enterprise is in the SMB space. If you uncover pain, you uncover that there's a real potential to solve a problem here. It's trying to accelerate that deal, obviously get a next meeting set up, but ideally escalate that rather quickly. Whereas I would say the highest level big difference when you get more into enterprise and strategic is maybe I have a conversation with you, Connor, and you kind of know there's a problem. You're not super lukewarm, or you're kind of just, I don't know, lukewarm in general about the overall thing. You can kind of articulate a problem, don't really know how impactful it is. Like, yes, this would be great if it's solved, but I don't get the sense that you have a real personal stake in this. At the enterprise level, like SMB, I might disqualify or kind of ask them if they can bring someone else like a director to the table. Whereas in the enterprise, sometimes maybe, hey, I'm speaking with this one specific team at a bank and they're lukewarm. Hey, could you introduce me to another team? And even though there's a chance I might waste my time, at the enterprise space, I find it often takes, 3 to 5 to 7 discovery calls with the same person and different teams to really uncover that pain. Whereas the SMB space, it's usually much more clear if there is one or is not. So yeah, that's a quick high level on my side.
Well said. And the only thing I'd add to that too is at a high level, I view it as your job is almost to build trust with the prospect that you are a subject matter expert in this space. One, like you understand a potential pain point or challenge that they're either aware of or maybe not thinking of and potentially have a solution for it. Your job isn't to sell them on this call. And that two, you're someone that actually is competent enough to potentially help them get this done. They're almost doing some subconscious math in their head. Like, okay, do I actually think there's a potential project here that could be successful and look good for me from an internal standpoint, like brand boost, promotion, things like that? And how long is it going to take potentially if I was to go through with this? Because I guess to preface this too, I've historically worked in roles where to close a deal, there are enterprise level deals that generally take anywhere from 5 to 10 calls plus. So it's like they could get on that first call and be like, oh, solution looks pretty cool. This could help out, but this person kind of seems like a schmuck and they don't know what they're doing. They're not going to, even if they think it's a potential good fit, they're an IT director or something, they're thinking, okay, I got to pull in my boss for this to happen. They got to figure out how they actually buy things internally. That's going to take a whole bunch of work. They have their own regular day jobs and priorities they're focused on. If they don't determine that you're someone who actually knows what they're talking about and can actually help them and be good to work with going forward. So that's just know that that's what their biggest fear is getting on these calls, is that they're going to get on a 30-minute call, give you the benefit of the doubt. You're going to ask a series of salesy, not great questions. Tell me about this. What's the impact of that on your business? And then you're going to aggressively push in a pushy way, ask for even more of their time at the end of the call. And if you haven't earned their trust or built credibility for yourself, the math's not going to add up in their head that this is worth another call or worth them staking their internal brand to bring in their boss or another stakeholder to that next call. So that's why I do think it's really important to come in with a structure and a framework, because that's what actually helps you come across as trustworthy and credible on these calls. How do you break down a typical 30-minute discovery call in your head? I know they don't all always go the same way or according to plan, but in general, what does a good discovery call look like and how do you structure it?
When I think for context too, when I first was an AE leading discovery calls, I was so worried about what questions to ask, how to do this, how to set that meeting, how to get the next step in place. And honestly, over time, as you get more, like some of this is experiential learning, right? So I hope this video helps you, but also you have to take calls, and not having an optimal call is just part of this process, especially early on. That being said, I think the biggest thing that has helped me to kind of take the burden off of what question do I ask, which if you're in that space, you're not present in the call, you're not really having a great dialogue, you're more worried about what you say than what the prospect says. But the biggest thing that's been an unlock for me is just roughly speaking, a 30-minute framework of 2 minutes reserved for like people showing up and or very brief introductions. I don't show a slide. I set the stage as to why we're here. I can get into that if you'd like. The next 18 or so minutes, so this would be in total, the first 20 minutes of the call, is 100% focused on them. So there's different frameworks. There's MEDDIC, there's BANT, there's command of the message. Again, like a simple one, if you're familiar with command of the message terminology, just learning about their current state and the negative consequences of what they're doing, if I even just have an in-depth conversation on that in a 30-minute call, that's usually a win. Now, I would like to get to more. I can get to more if we are having a good conversation and they're very succinct, they understand exactly what they need. But I just want to preface, like, if I just have a 30-minute conversation around that and we're having a great dialogue, a next follow-up call makes sense for everyone. Like that is a great outcome, in my opinion, especially as you get to the enterprise space, where if someone is so deeply talking about their problems, what they're doing, and it really resonates, and you know that, let them go. I'm not trying to force anything. I just want to hear all about it, because whether it's with them, whether it's with someone else, I'm in a great position on that next call to kind of loop them in, show them I understand, et cetera. But anyway, let's say kind of cookie cutter, prospect comes in, they're willing to share information, but they also want to see a glimpse of our platform. Again, that first 20 minutes across the 2-minute intro and the 18-minute just asking them questions, again, generally about what they're doing today and the negative consequences of that. Maybe if I have time, like what would an ideal solution look like regardless of who it's from? Then the last 10 minutes of the call, I spend about 6 minutes, if I have the time and if it's appropriate, talking about, hey, here's 2 or 3 major things that you mentioned, and here's how that maps onto our platform. Again, pending the vibe of the conversation, that may be as simple as literally showing one visual slide. It may even be just a conversation, but I would say, it's not uncommon for me to hop into the platform and show like 2 major features. So, in the case of selling automation, someone wants to automate this deployment sequence on XYZ or whatever it is. I may show, hey, I'm going to recap what they said, validate that that's what they means. And again, this is in the 6-minute period here. And then I'm going to show them 1 or 2 things at most in the platform that demonstrates that at a high level. Set the tone that, hey, here's what you wanted to see. I'm going to show this to you with the little time that we have left, but I'd love to go deeper into it on our next call. So I'm already planting that seed as I'm pulling the platform up. But the big thing I'd say there is I'm literally showing 1 or 2 platforms. I'm not logging in. I'm not showing how to create a team. I'm not showing how to set up a new project. I'm literally like, here's the Eureka state. And I'm showing that one thing that they really would benefit from the most to plant the seeds for the next call. I can break that down further. I just say on the last 4 minutes, I save, generally speaking, 4 minutes to set up the next step so we can get into what that looks like. But I just want to reiterate, I can tell you this and that. I can do all of these different things. But at the end of the day, you have the SVP of cloud from Nike on a call and he's pouring, or she is pouring their heart out about all of the problems they're having. I'm just going to let them go, because having a follow-up call only makes sense. But that's kind of how I approach it, right?
I approach it in a similar structure. I really like what you said about the questioning and just letting them go. Like, yeah, you can come in with planned questions, but it's more important. You want to hear from them. And I think a lot of people, they don't even realize this. Questions are very powerful, but I think reps are overtrained in question asking and not trained enough in bringing a strong point of view. I call these things credibility statements. I view that as part of that first 2 minutes or so, 2 to 5 minutes of the call, depending how long the small talk goes. But it doesn't need to be anything fancy, but I like to share or kick off anywhere from 30 seconds. I'm introducing myself, the team I'm a part of, the vertical I support, and what we do. But I'm offering a point of view as to why I set up the call, or like the types of priorities and challenges I essentially tend to work on, and the business outcomes we focus on achieving with customers, but want to get their feedback from them in an introduction as well. Like almost prompting them and giving them ideas so that I don't even have to ask those questions in the first place to get them to start sharing pain. I've found that if you come in with a strong point of view and you say, here's what we do, here's the types of priorities and challenges we solve, et cetera, and you've made it targeted to their job title, their industry, or whatever research you've done beforehand, you're not always going to be right, but it gets them thinking when they otherwise were just going to sit there and check Slack. They're like, oh, wait, yeah, we do care about that. What do you guys do there? And it gets them to open up that way. When it comes to uncovering real pain, because that I view that as, I agree, the main goal of a discovery call is to latch on to 1 or 2 very specific important pain points to them that are worth them setting up a next call and potentially bringing on another stakeholder. Are there any tactics you use to get beyond surface level answers? If you know in your head, like, I actually think we can help this person, they're just not thinking about it the right way, and they're giving you bland, like, all right, we're trying to be more efficient. Yeah. How do you actually get them to open up and get to that, what's often referred to as second level or third level operational or business pain?
Yeah, and I'm sure here we could talk about hypotheticals for like an hour plus. I at the simplest level, and I'll break it down in more detail, but there's always that kind of saying of why anything, why now, why us. So I think, just always like, hey, why do they need to do anything in the first place? Why would they do that now, be it 6 to 12 months? And then why would they use us specifically? And that kind of helps you, I would say, not that you have that exact conversation with a prospect, but that's always a good barometer to like help you craft your questions that kind of guide them down that structure. Just for reference, selling my entire career from a technical sales perspective, I have sold open source solutions. So they're basically using a free version. And oftentimes we are competing, either what you could argue is like competing against ourselves, like them using the free version, but realistically it's do nothing, So, hey, it broke this one time as an example of many, like selling open source databases. It broke. Is that going to happen again? What happens if that happens again? Why haven't you fixed that, right? There are different varying degrees of problems that they've already identified, but it's really an understanding. Like another example comes to mind more recently on an open source automation platform I sold, where we were working with someone who had an outage for 8 hours because they were using our free version on Black Friday. And that sounds great. That's a great thing to say, hey, we've uncovered this pain. But the reality is that happened one time on Black Friday. It had not happened since, and it was like the summer. So we're now 6 months beyond when that happened. And while they feared that it could happen again, I had to really dive into why that happened in the first place and paint a picture of why like they were not secure. So it's like, hey, they built processes to try and avoid that. But if they were moving towards our enterprise platform, they would have the ability to actually, using technology, ensure that it never happens again. So even what you'll find is, again, like I'm getting too niche, like pull me out if I'm too deep here.
No, this is good.
Yeah, I hope this answers your question, where it's like, even though someone will tell you, hey, Connor, we lost, $800,000 last year because we had an 8-hour outage on Black Friday. In this case, the number was significantly more than that. But they'll say, hey, if you actually sit there, the average rep is going to say, great, like we've uncovered this pain. Of course you would want our enterprise platform. That's what they're thinking in the back of their mind. But when you actually dive in, when you are solving for some of those pains, you find that even though the company doesn't have that fully addressed, they are still taking steps manually. Even though it's duct tape on a broader problem, they're still going to take a ton of steps to try and prevent that from getting worse and worse over time because their job depends on it. So if you take it at, the headline of, hey, they lost $3 million last year because of an 8-hour outage and they don't have the ability to protect that again, that sounds great, but talk to more of their engineers or talk to that person individually like, hey, that sounds horrible. We're 6 months down the line. What's different now? And like you have to sit there and really be competent enough in your own problem space to know the questions to ask, but also not let the prospect who tells you that and says, hey, this is great, I want to see a demo. It's like, hey, before we get there, I just really need to understand what you're doing now and what you've taken, because that's going to impact what I show you in our platform. So again, I'm getting super niche here. I hope that's not like too far down the rabbit hole, but I think a lot of people take that stuff for granted. And to your point, they're trained on questions. They're not trained on a holistic 30-minute to 60-minute call and how to guide someone exactly where you need to be to uncover the real significance of what you're trying to solve.
Yeah, no, I was good. I'm looking for the nitty gritty. Another tactic I'll give people too, to kind of, I like your point about guiding them to where you think the conversation would be going, is asking context-led questions. So not just asking the questions you're trained, because when reps start first initially running these calls and trying to uncover real pain, I felt this way, and a lot of the feedback we hear from reps is that's where I start to feel salesy, especially when it's like trying to quantify business impact. Like, what does that mean for your business? Or what would that mean if we could reduce 5 tools to 1? And then they're like, that'd be cool. Like we'd save a bunch of money. Tell them the reason why you're asking the question. I think that's one of my favorite lines in sales is the reason I ask, or the I only ask because. So like ask the question, but then prompt them, or that's why I call them like context-led questions. Tell them why you ask. Like, so you're using vendor A for planning. What are you using for X, Y, and Z? A lot of reps will just stop there. What are you using for this? What are you using for that? And it'll just feels salesy, like you're trying to lead them somewhere, where I'll more ask the question like, what are you using for X, Y, Z? And I only ask because a lot of customers we work with who are using vendor A, like your competitor, they told you they were using these other 3 vendors, and we were able to consolidate that onto one platform and save them X amount of money in the process. So I'm just curious if you've thought about that. That's just like an off the cuff example, but it's a less salesy way of kind of leading them. Don't make them that's where they feel salesy, when they can tell you're just asking questions for the sake of ending at some destination you're hoping. Just don't hide it. Just tell them why you're asking the question. It's not salesy, it's natural, and they start to trust you more, and they can see where you're going with this. So those are like tactical things you can do to actually start uncovering real pain. I guess wrapping up here, let's say we focused a lot on those middle 20 minutes or so, uncovering the real pain. Let's say the call goes pretty well. A lot of times when it goes really well, the next steps kind of just naturally set themselves. And a lot of times they're the one asking what next steps are, and they make it easy. That's how you know you really ran a good call and that there's a potential good fit here. But what about those middle ground calls where you don't think they're seeing the vision yet, but you actually think this is worth pursuing and setting a next step? How do you go about wrapping up that call in the last 4 minutes and solidifying a next step without sounding pushy?
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, here, hopefully this just gives you ideas of things you can do versus the exact script, because exactly to your point, like if I have a lukewarm call with you, there's interest, but I can tell maybe you're not going to be that champion for me. I still want to leverage that into an introduction. However, let's say the flip side is you clearly define that you want to get a trial going. And I can even tell if I gave you a trial, decent chance you'd be successful. I have to very carefully almost pump the brakes and make sure we have alignment all the way up and down the org before we get into that trial and kind of almost test them early on. I would say a general framework here, let's say first discovery call, let's call it like a mid-sized organization. You've done a good job articulating it, but I'm kind of wishy-washy on if you're going to be the person to take us to the promised land. I think a good next step in this scenario is like, one, if I show the demo, it really resonates. They're like, wow, that's great. I might even put it on them to kind of get a sense for their experience and also influence within the organization. And after I show that, like, hey, this is great. I know we've got about 4 minutes left here. I have some thoughts on next step, but I'm curious from your perspective, what do you think would be a good way to keep going? Because we've only breached the surface here, right? Yeah. See, and honestly, that again, I may not always do that, because to your point, if this is like, we're absolutely killing it, maybe even in discovery, they're saying, hey, my boss, Jessica, or whoever is that, has extreme insight. I may not even put the ball in their court, because I'll just say, hey, this went really well. Do you think it would be appropriate on our next call to bring Jessica in, as one example of many? But I'm just going to go ahead and cut through the noise and make that ask to go right there again, if the call is going well. Yeah. But honestly, I think you get a very good sense for, hey, I'm glad it sounds like there's something here. I'm curious what your thoughts are on next steps. Another question that I may ask also is like, I may get something on the calendar. So, hey, Connor, we just breached the surface. I'd love to give you a more in-depth overview of what we do. And I know you mentioned, these two people or the SRE team would have an interest. Do you think we could get maybe 2 people from them to come to our next call, see how they respond to that? Once that is in place, then from there, I might ask a question. Again, I've literally sent the invite out on the phone. They've already verbally committed to that next call. Now I'm going to take 1 or 2 chances at, what may be a salesy question, but also for the sake of like making sure we are, progressing things forward and not wasting either party's time. It's like, hey, I know we have a long way to go here, and I don't want to get ahead of myself. We can definitely talk about this more on the next call. But, I'm just curious, like when you guys have typically bought solutions like this before, what does that look like, right? I may take a shot on that. That's like the highest level general question, but I may get a feel for or try to understand, hey, I know right now you want a demo, and I think we can definitely get there. Our team is going to need a few people involved in that process. Just for my reference too, again, I know we've got a long way to go, but you mentioned Director Sally, Jane, or whoever. Is that who would ultimately sign off? Like, those are examples of questions. Again, once I've actually sent the invite, they verbally agreed to that next step. I'm going to make sure I get at least someone else on that call, or at least make that ask very clear. And then also I'm going to take 1 or 2 chances on trying to understand their buying process, and or ideally who would ultimately sign off, so I can start working backwards down the line. But again, those are all examples. That's not the golden script. To your point, I'm going to dial that up or down based on how the call went. Curious your thoughts on that, or any other context you have as well.
No, I think that's a great overview. I like to get the next step solidified. If I haven't disqualified and I think this is worth pursuing, I honestly tend to just recommend next steps, and I don't even like to open it up to them to get. I'll recommend it and then get their thoughts. I don't like to even ask for their thoughts first and give them the chance for an out. I just like to, I'm the one who works in this space every day. I know how software is bought. I have an idea of what I think based on the conversation the next step should be, and recommend that to them. And then of course, open it to them to get confirmation that they agree. And then get that sent out, accepted. And then that's when I agree, you can start asking some of those other buying decision type questions now that they've agreed that a next step is worth it here. So, but I don't think people need to overcomplicate that. A lot of times when you run an effective call, the next steps kind of naturally set themselves and you don't face much resistance. So
yeah. And I mean, again, there's so many general examples here, but I also think to your point, it's like, if I'm talking to an individual engineer and I'm curious, like, hey, I may ask about their buying process to see if they've actually done this before, because I'm sure you've experienced this, and regardless of if it's engineers or any different persona, there's a lot of people that want to look good. They want to show off to their boss, or they're finally taking their career more seriously and want to promote. And they just kind of go rogue and, fill out a demo request on behalf of the entire SRE team, but they've actually never done this before. So again, to your point, I totally agree. Like, maybe it's clear they have influence, or maybe you're even further up the chain. You have a director on the call. Setting those next steps and not even giving them that opportunity is a great way as well. So again, the point being is, I think it depends. So, which hopefully isn't a pop out answer. But,
and then one final detail too, and I know you made a GPT specifically for this in AI Sales Accelerator, but is that follow-up kind of recap email if you've set a next step. Just, this is part of what goes into building that trust and credibility that you're someone who's worth spending more time with, is that within 30 minutes to an hour, ideally after the call, send them a detailed. Again, ChatGPT makes this a lot easier now than it used to be. That used to be one of my least favorite parts. If you're still doing that manually, you're just wasting your time. You shouldn't be. But that's one of those things where it's like, they get off the call, they're like, that went well, but then they go back to their day-to-day, but then they see your recap message that's making it really easy to share with your internal peers and look professional. And it does a good job of actually recapping what they're focused on internally or the pain points he shared. They'll be like, all right, this person's on the ball. Like, that's what they're thinking in their head. And it just increases the likelihood that they invest more into those next calls and bringing in other stakeholders and other things that you'll ultimately need them to do to lead to a closed deal. So
definitely.
This, appreciate you sharing this. I think it's on a lot of reps' minds. We have a lot of SDR content on both of our channels, and a lot of them use that and they promote to account executive, but then this is a whole new game once you get into actually running these calls yourself, and you're not just kicking off the intro and passing it over to AE. Like, now it's on you to run an effective call. So I don't know if there's any final thoughts you have, but otherwise appreciate you coming on to share your framework with the audience here.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, it's on you, I think, first and foremost, to understand your problem space, like we talked about, your product, et cetera, et cetera. But again, all of this is a framework, but also, again, keep in mind, like, hopefully you've been in sales long enough to understand, like, you don't have to have the answers either. I don't want to, it's easy for us to sit here and riff all day on what we would do, how we would handle this situation. There's still very many times where we'll run into never having, experienced this question or this scenario before, but also, if you've actually done that work, you actually understand your product, your company, your problem space, et cetera, then your questions are genuinely curious about, I have never seen this before. What would this be? So I just want to call that out. It's always easy for us to be on a podcast here and make it sound super simple. That's never the intention. Hopefully this equipped you with, again, more a framework, different tools you can pull out at the right time. And yeah, Connor, thanks for having me on again, man. Always a pleasure.
Well said. Thanks for coming on.